for joining the CU Try Show. I'm going to restart that again. We've been off a little bit the month of June while working on building our infrastructure for our community violence response effort. We look forward to sharing more updates with you about that. But today is also the start of Minority or BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month. And I am so privileged to have Chandra Somerville with me, and I'm going to let her introduce herself because she has a very rich and dynamic bio to sort of kick off that conversation about Mental Health Awareness Month or BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month. We're going to use those phrases interchangeably. The other thing that I want to say, before I do the introductions about Chandra, is the views and the opinions of our guests are their own, and we're able to do the show thanks to our generous and forever donors and funders who kind of make this work possible. So without further ado, it is an absolute beautiful day to kick off this conversation. And Chandra, welcome. Let you introduce yourself because you believe in cultural introductions, and I didn't want to do the resume.
Well, thank you, everyone. I am Chandra Somerville, and I am born and raised in Champaign. Went away, went to college, had some lived experience in the state of Arkansas, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, actually. And then I came back after living there for about 6.5 years to garner support from my village to raise my son, who is Adrian. Adrian also resides here in Champaign, Urbana. And then I came back here and started on a journey of how do I get involved in my community and really begin to learn about the things that were passionate through my own eyes. I want to just say I am the daughter of the late Willie T. and Valerian Somerville. They were educators in the Urbana schools, as well as my father was in the Champaign School District. And I haven't heard anybody say that they didn't like my parents. And they were teachers. Yeah. That's like really like very profound. Yeah. Even though we were always realistic in knowing that, everyone has people that may not like them. But I just wanted to say that just because it was just one of those things that I am still navigating, where while I was foundationally raised with a great foundation just culturally and just the love for community and a value of building community, and particularly the Black community. Yeah. I really was centered around that and the wellness and the health of that being a part of my life, and that being Black wasn't a risk factor. The mental health and mental wellness of Black people was never a risk factor. And so to be able to say that that was a value practiced in my home, I am very grateful for. And so I am glad to be here. Yes, I do have a resume, but I think I'm going to focus today on who I am, and we're going to go in that vein of that, if that's okay with you, Karen.
Sounds great. I will say in full transparency that Chandra was one of the first people I met after moving here, and it has been a really amazing story and experience seeing Champaign through her eyes, hearing her stories about her family and her parents. And that has really shaped and defined my view of this community. And, every time I hear about the complexities about Champaign and Urbana, when I hear about the community and that you were born and raised and cultivated and grew in, I also hear about resiliency and resourcing. And, Try always says it takes a village to heal. And it's, when you recount your stories, that's what you sort of embodied, embrace. It's what I've seen. It's what I know you offer through your work and resume, is this sort of healing centered approach. And it was, again, it's how you were born and raised, and it's also what you offer. So thank you. And, the other piece about the story, thinking of the village, and I know you is that our kids, we, having had the chance to sort of partner together a lot, we got a chance to, have our kids grow up as a part of a village of support for each other. And when we talk about Black mental health or minority mental health, that building those networks of support were invaluable. And, Adrian, Lyric, Amina, all of the kiddos puppy puddling together while we did work, and they bonded and supported, and they still are this network of support. Just as sort of a modeling that I know you and I both hope more people can think about and imagine for themselves.
Absolutely.
Okay, so without further ado, the reason why I reached out to you, to kick off this conversation, is that the theme of the year is making the invisible visible, right? Sort of beyond just the stories for minority mental health. And I know it is, or BIPOC mental health, and we might want to explain what BIPOC is, because I think people don't necessarily always know. But from your work in Lens and Filter, why do you think it is important to sort of get beyond the headlines, the stories, to make the invisible visible? Why do you think that that's the theme for this year?
Sure. So what has happened, and just to make sure that we're clear on what BIPOC is, it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Yeah. And so oftentimes people of color are often just just kind of put in that box of Black people as well. And one of the things I have appreciated is that they have separated and segregated that out. And so I just wanted to make sure that we talked about that acronym. But for so long, the contributions of BIPOC people have not been valued. Their work has been seen as a result of how others are rewarded for it. But oftentimes, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color are not celebrated for the contributions that they're making. And I think it's important to now begin recognizing that although we have the story of being enslaved, the stories that talk about the inhumane things that Black people came into this country, that's a whole nother conference, Karen, because now the curriculum is calling it involuntary immigration. There's voluntary immigration and involuntary immigration. And so I'm like, whew, okay. So this is what is a narrative that is being put out about this involuntary placement. But with all of that, what I really have appreciated is that we are finally being able to be seen for our competence, contribution. None of that is magic. We have worked hard to actually do this work, get the work done, and to begin a healing process of what happens when you recognize that trauma is not your only story, but that recovery and healing also is a part of the story. Yes, resilience comes as a result of what do you do in spite of, but what would happen if we as a community were born healed? And so I believe that coming into this conversation, coming into this month in particular, giving that invisible visible now, or their voices, celebrating the contributions, not just celebrating the story of resilience, is really important in this month.
Yeah. So can we go back? I want to like, because I love where you went. Wasn't what I was into, but can we go back to this whole BIPOC piece? Because I think a lot of people don't know where it came from. And for me, when I went back and researched some of the origins, right, around why even Black was pulled out, it was around let's center Blackness at the heart of our understanding of people of color's experience, Black and Indigenous folks, because when we think about the hierarchy of vulnerability, so frequently Black-bodied and Indigenous folks, and for those people who don't know what Indigenous is, we're thinking about people who were here first, right? Like who inhabited the land, are often sort of missed, and that if we designed our lens and where we centered our gaze around those who are most vulnerable, we would start to sort of see, right, more potential. And I know that's even become controversial, and I want to, and hopefully that makes sense. And Chandra, make sure I'm making, right, I'm keeping it simple, right? You know, I think about linguistic competence, but I also know that there's even like a push now to even move beyond BIPOC to think global majority. And I don't even know how that resonates with people, but when I think about making the invisible visible, global majority, I mean, I love the vulnerability centering, but I also think the power shift or the resiliency focus that you were talking about gets captured in the global majority terminology. So help me out. Did I make any of that make sense? And what are your ideas about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, going back to their contributions, that is like they help build it. It's not, we see their stories every single day, but because they were not celebrated, it's oftentimes stories that are put down, or not the stories, it's the people that are oftentimes put down. And so I think it's interesting that you have heard you say global majority, because there's still even a fight about that, because it's like, when did we become this global majority? When did they become a global majority? When in actuality, we've never been here. We just may not have been counted.
Yeah. So again, right, that's the thought, like there are more of us than, you know, and we look across the globe, we, you know, are the representative group as opposed to minority in terms of the framing that, you know, we sort of had historically.
Yeah. So I celebrate, I definitely celebrate that, that it's finally coming where it can be seen. I won't just say at the surface, but it's finally becoming where it's like, we are here. We've always been here.
Yeah.
And this is where we have been.
And,
I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, no. And I think, you know, so I'm gonna have us dial back a little bit because I think we would be remiss, right? So the reason why we've got to talk about making the invisible visible, or the cost of not being seen or heard, is that when we look at the numbers and data, and I promise we're going to get back to resiliency, but when we look at the numbers of data, many people of color, Black-bodied people, people from the diaspora, people from the global majority, particularly in the United States, right, have a number of unaddressed mental health needs, or frequently aren't served and supported, right? Like we know the numbers and data say that in our helping systems and our mental health systems and our physical health systems, their ways of presenting in the world get pathologized, demonized, right? They don't get served and supported well. It's why you do the work that you do. And it's why we have to have a month sort of dedicated to acknowledging it. So can we talk a little bit about kind of what we know about vulnerability, right? Because we can talk resiliency, but we also know that there are a lot of signs and symptoms of vulnerability.
Yes, so because because a lot of BIPOC people were not included in data and research about healing solutions, that makes them vulnerable. And so when we think about even the mental health of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, their freedom was oftentimes characterized as an illness.
Yeah. You have to say more because a lot of people don't know.
I'm going to say it. So when I first got into the field, I attended a conference where we were talking about just the historical perspective of why stigma is attached to, in particularly communities of color, Black people, Indigenous people. It was because it was viewed as a mental illness. So in the DSM, there was a mental illness called drapetomania. And drapetomania was a mental illness that was described as a runaway slave. And the treatment for this mental illness of a slave running away was beating. How do you recover from that and call it wellness? And so when we think about the vulnerability of those communities, if freedom or someone who was running away from enslavement was viewed as an illness or a disease, there is so many even factors of how supports are not even available or even centered around their being, because it was attached always to enslavement or captivity.
Absolutely. And when I heard the same story, and I heard it even recently, that the symptom of the mental illness was that you had scars on your back. That's how people could know that you had the mental illness, and the cure was more scars on your back. Talk about, and I think that, when we think about Black body folks who grew up in the Americas, Latinx folks, again, many of the ways that, right, Latinx folks and people who are from various Hispanic backgrounds have been demonized, pathologized. Even their healing practices have been labeled as, not Christian, or, crazy, or a whole bunch of words that we just don't find appropriate. We've just really pathologized so much of the, again, diversity of experiences. When I look at the data around schizophrenia diagnosis with, people, as particularly Black bodied folks, or they say that the largest treatment provider of mental health services is our criminal justice system, right? People who are incarcerated get more mental health services and supports, which to me says that a number of people who were incarcerated had untreated mental health needs or undertreated mental health needs, and ended up, incarcerated to get the care that they needed. I remember when I first moved here, the mental health system in Indiana was so broken that the only place that you could get treated for there was no community-based care. And the only place that you could get care would be to be incarcerated. And so that became the setup that you would have to go to jail if you needed to see a psychiatrist, or if you needed medication. I mean, that's a broken system. So, right, that only prioritizes wealth, affluence. And again, we've expanded a little bit thanks to things like, the Affordable Care Act. But if, for those folks who were between the cracks, there wasn't and isn't a lot of care and support for them.
Absolutely.
And I know you're seeing that in your work and some of the advocacy that you get a chance to do.
Yeah, it's and where it's now shifting, where we haven't really talked about, is the maternal health. People that are carrying babies under stressful situations, and and then when they're born, the mothers are so stressed, or their bodies are just so unhealthy. And just the infant mortality, the death of the infants that pass away at birth, but also the mothers that also die during childbirth due to medical negligence. And also there's really, the light is starting to be shined on medical racism as well.
Yeah. Right. And so we're talking about, so for the audience, right? So we're talking historical traumas impact mental health and treatment and access. We're talking current traumas impact treatment and access, and and current being like how you live and what your communities look like and what is available to you as a resource, in a diagnostic piece. And then also like what happens from the moment you might be conceived. What are the vulnerabilities? What are the risk factors that even shape and define? People who have tuned in and listened to this show have heard us talk about things like adverse childhood experiences. And we, think, oh, that's, once you're born, right? Like what happens to you. But as Chandra was mentioning, we know a lot from the data and science that what happens to you in utero impacts, shapes and define your life even before you're there. So the health of the mom, the support she has, the nutrition, the access, the protective factors that we're going to talk about, the assets, all make a difference in her ability to give birth to a healthy child, to give birth in a community that sees, recognizes, and supports her, that impacts IQ and all of those things. And I know you've heard me talk about the New York study that they've done at Columbia and replicated in a couple different places where they gave moms an extra $200 a month and some support during her pregnancy, and babies whose mom, right, like moms who were given that extra $200 a month and a little bit of support, babies came out with higher IQ. Moms, they came out higher, birth weight, they came out with fewer risk factors, and those progresses managed throughout time. So we spent a lot of time sometimes thinking about remediation and reading programs and literacy programs and all of that stuff once they're born, but just a simple extra $200 a month, sort of what we did with the child tax credit, made a difference in early childhood, early development, children's life trajectory from the beginning. But again, when we think about mental health, we tend to not think about that like early childhood stuff. We tend to only think about like once you're born and like kindergarten age. But I'm really hoping the audience knows that this conversation about making the invisible visible is around really thinking about mental health broader than just symptoms, but about the life conditions and context that people show up at. What am I missing? Oh, you're still muted.
I noticed that you kind of brought everyone up to speed. Okay. But I think also it's important that we highlight again that this is what helps build healthy communities and healed communities.
Yeah.
So just having the value, not just of the life in the womb, but the life that is outside of the womb.
Yeah.
Also, and the people that are going to be carrying life. And so I think it's all related. So nope, you didn't miss it. I just want to affirm it.
And so before we shift gears and talk more about the resiliency, which is where we started this conversation, we've talked about women, maternal health, and those vulnerabilities. I also think, and I'm not sure, right, like I know you're tuned into this, that so I'm going to just sort of be like Karen and not Karen professional, but I also feel like we don't talk enough about the vulnerabilities of Black men who could be fathers, are fathering, serve in uncle, daddy, grandparent roles, and how so often all of the structural stigmas, the structural oppression, the realities, again, medical, you name it, and projections about Black masculinity or Black maleness, how that also creates a lot of historical mental health trauma, right? And so so what I know, like we're talking about moms needing to be well in order to produce great children. The dads who are creating those children also need to be mentally well, because it takes kind of two to create a child. And I don't think we give enough thinking to the mental wellness of Black men. What do you think about that?
No, and I think it also just kind of goes back to the stigma around it, but also this projection that they are a symbol of strength too, protective, the ability to see them as strong people, or that they have the ability to carry it because they are physically stronger. And so I totally agree with that, which goes to just even the importance. One day I was driving and I noticed I passed by at least 15 men walking kids to school.
Mm-hmm.
And I just said, I wonder if they would think I was crazy if I took pictures of them as they were walking their children to school, or whoever is in their lives. But at that moment, going back to what you said, I said, what a beautiful display of just men walking their children to school. Oftentimes, those are those protective factors that we don't even think about. Yeah. But it's oftentimes seen, I wonder if that child is okay because it's a man taking them to school. And so, no, I don't think it's talked about enough, or their wellness and their health, because they're oftentimes questioned about when they are with children. What is their purpose? Who are they with? Where is their mother, or where is the female person in the mix? Because we know, so that is definitely a systematic stigma that is associated with male presence in people's lives.
And I know I'm in too many spaces, and you're there, that so often the conversation, so I loved you elevating the dads walking their kids, but so often when we are talking about Black men or men of color, the conversation is about them being violent or absent or incarcerated. And and I know, based on the literature data, but also personal experience, that when people only see you from this very deficit pathological model, it is hard not to internalize some of that. It is hard not to feel like you can be seen, heard, validated. That wounds the soul, which creates mental distress. And I don't think that people, I mean, from my experience, and again, I'm not universal, but when men have the external and internal supports to be involved in their children's lives, they do. However, when there are structural barriers that get in the way of that happening, or they don't have access to the mental health resources and supports to show up in the ways that they want, mental health or substance use, right? And they're kind of bi-directional, then they're not available. But we don't, in some ways, we haven't said that, oh, when men who produce children can't be available, it's probably, we should be asking what happened to them. Instead, we say, that's just not who they are. And I just don't know men of color who don't want to be present, right? Like when they are healthy and well and supported, they do and are walking their kids and hype and very involved and sacrificing and giving up and going the extra mile. But imagine if we had a society where we noticed that and saw them and recognized and validated, as opposed to, right, demonized and pathologized. But help me.
So I wonder, and this is where like the hard part is, because oftentimes that portrayal of that kind of masculinity is viewed as masculinity, where the other is viewed as feminine. So I think it's really a journey that we both, as Black women and Black men, have to come together in community and acknowledge that it is okay that we walk, think, believed from a healed place.
Yeah.
Instead of embodying what has been put upon us,
Yeah.
that we are violent, that we are not present, or that we're broken.
Yeah. So let's
and the hard part is because foundationally that's what was, or how things were portrayed. It's kind of like playing a game. You're playing offense and defense at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so putting shows like Try and other types of shows that do show positive outlook on how both men and women are in community. And then also encouraging it among young people as well.
Yeah. Because
oftentimes they are not encouraged to do this together, but kind of like in competition with each other.
Mm. So you said something, and I'm just going to continue to ask you to flesh out this conversation. So do you think it's primarily an internal conversation, or is it an external conversation?
Internal to what?
You're right, because you said part of the journey starts off with Black men and women kind of coming together and acknowledging. I wonder how much of how we are responding is based on external projections, right? Like, because I think the larger society has this view that maybe we get sort of swept into because of internalized racism and sexism and blah, blah, blah. So again, right, like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it us coming together, or is it us making the invisible visible and making sure that other people from other groups who project implicit bias and racist ideas and all of that, that shape and define, like in some ways, what gets projected about who we are, what our stories are, how we live, how we parent. Right. So does that question kind of make sense? Like where is it like where do we start? Is it so much internally, or is it a lot of projection that we get caught up into?
So I think there is definitely some projection because of the internet. And I will just be honest, we have a lot more exposure to positive images of things than not. And so I think that there is a bigger conversation on allowing ourselves to, it's an internal and external conversation. Let me answer your question. The external conversation is, do not see me when you see me as a deficit. I am here, I am present, I have this to offer, not just a recipient to take. I have something to offer, I have something to give. And so I think oftentimes there is a narrative, especially in helping in service systems, to see that we have to be here to help, when in actuality, what if we said they are here to help contribute and build up in communities, and begin to change that narrative? So that is an external conversation. The internal conversation is honestly how you view yourselves, and how you view each other. And so that's why I said it's a both and.
Okay.
um, it's a conversation of regardless of where you are you always trying to get to the next thing, or are you enough with where you are today?
Yeah.
No, you may not have all the money, you may not have the big house, you may not have these things, but do you have like emotional support? Do you have family support? Do you have those protective factors that you speak of? And in community, can we talk about that commitment to wanting to learn, wanting to see culture from not just a deficit base, but from a strengths base? So I can't put it on either or. I'm going to say it's probably both and.
Okay.
Because people are going to project when they feel, they're going to project when they're feeling powerless.
Yeah.
And they're going to use their power to be like, okay, let's keep you so that you won't get power.
Yeah.
Then there is this internal space of when you don't feel enough, you're pushing to do other harm so that you can make sure you feel enough and more powerful. That is why I believe it's a both and conversation.
Okay. So you're talking, and I'm going to say this explicitly. So I don't know if you know, but I'm like working with in training with this guy named Thomas Hubel, who does work around collective trauma, and has this conceptualization of trauma as something that interrupts our ability to become, and belong. And I've sort of really embraced that. So so all the things that you're describing are traumas, right? Like, so when things get in the way of my feeling like I can be who I am in all of my expressions and how I want to see myself, to become who what I'm divinely created to be, or, and belong in community and relationship and situations, that's traumatic, right? And until I can become, and belong, I'm going to sort of live out the reflections of my trauma. And so often I think, right, we pathologize people's normal adaptive responses to trauma. So again, if I feel like I've got to have a lot of material possessions in order to belong, because that gives me maybe a sense of identity, or, I think, we're of the generation where I think we were socialized and raised that somehow moving into class privilege would protect you from racism. And so, if you get socialized to believe that the more class and wealth you acquire, the less likely your child or you are to experience racism, discrimination, the effects of oppression, then you could really buy into this idea that the acquisition of stuff is a protective factor. And then the mental health stress comes where you realize that you couldn't protect your children from discrimination or microaggressions or real aggressions or whatever. And it didn't matter how polite, well-groomed, educated, degreed you had, that you still experienced hiccups. And that causes mental health distress. And I think a lot of people get caught up in those adaptive patterns where they're just struggling to sort of deal with the world that wasn't right, like what we promised. And again, all of the being, right? Like, what is a healthy expression to be male, female, Black body, trans, right? Like all of various expressions of identity that we just sort of get in the way. So I guess I just want to say everything that you languaged was what happens when you're experiencing trauma. And, part of what we hope to deal with, and I know it's part of your mission vision, is to deal with those sort of institutional structural things that reinforce those traumas, right? So that people can really move into healing. So you mentioned a couple of times protective factors. So we've had a conversation about risk factors. What are those things? Like if I'm sitting at home and I'm like, okay, my ability to be, become, and belong, or impaired, or, impacted, or that I'm seeing symptoms of mental health distress. What could I do? What do you want to help people understand about what protective factors are, or what does mental resilience for people of color look like, feel like?
So one is definitely family support. Family support and showing up is definitely a protective factor. And family support is not necessarily people who are related to you. It's looking at your entire community from a collective space, which I think is missed in a lot of different ways, just because structurally we have segregated and separated communities to be like, okay, I want to do this alone. I can go it alone and someone can help me get mine. And then maybe I can help somebody else, but usually it's more transactional. I think collective community support, familial support is definitely a protective factor. Another thing is how we use our time, not just to work all the time. Are there recreational? Is there play? Is there time to just kind of be in space? That is definitely a protective factor. I'm noticing all of the preparation for family barbecues this weekend. And even though it's the 4th of July and it's attached to something else, for some people, a day off is honestly a free space to collectively just be able to be and have recreation and leisure time. Another protective factor is the ability to have a commitment or a value of learning, not just learning what you see, or learning to accomplish something, but actually just learning to expose you to different cultures, different ideas, different beliefs that might be different from yours. Also having empathy. And I don't think we talk about that enough. Just that whole value of caring for someone else or caring about someone else, regardless if they do belong to you or do not, which also goes back to the importance of community building. And then one that we don't like to talk about a whole lot, just because I believe it's a culture of just substance to keep our minds free. But also a protective factor is not having alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs in the home is a huge thing when you do have that, those toxins that are out of your body. And we'd also know in Black and Brown communities where it's sold, oftentimes it's at higher rates of alcohol, higher rates of menthol, higher rates of other things. And so we don't talk about that a lot. Different drugs that might be coming into those communities that will mess up those minds and impact because the stress is there. And so those are some protective factors that we can think about from or for Black families.
Yeah. So for the audience, all of those things are around wellness, right? So we want people to have work-life balance. We want you to rest and play. We want you to have family support. We want you to have restraint and discipline around substances. And from a neurobiological perspective, I always lean onto this, like wellness requires us to be optimal, right? So, we're going to talk about producing healthy kids or raising healthy kids or being healthy adults. We've got to keep cortisol, which is stress hormones, low. And so many of the signs and symptoms of mental unwellness come from a I'm going to say this, a dysregulated nervous system. And then when that nervous system isn't well regulated, the chemicals that help impact our mood and our mental health, serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, adrenaline, all anxiety, depression, right? Like all of those things get out of balance. And when we're not being well, it's hard to, and I know empathy is a complicated one, right? When I think about the brain and the way that we teach empathy, and people don't know this, and a lot of times, but there's this whole science of gratitude, and I know there's toxic positivity, but there is a science of gratitude that says if and when we are in service to others and in community and doing something, doesn't matter where we are in our stage and phase of life or how little or much we have, but when we're giving and in gratitude, our brains stay happier, and we're less likely to feel depression, disconnection, to feel mentally unwell, to become addicted to substances. And I think we've missed, I go back to where we started this conversation. One of the things that you learned from your family, and that sometimes I think because we've been so busy working or doing that, we forgot about the being. We've missed that, like, giving back altruism that teaches empathy and gratitude and keeps our brains happy. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm listening.
And so when you do or create that space of gratitude, there's also grace.
Yeah.
That oftentimes isn't a part of that as well, for when we do make mistakes. You know what I'm saying? And so when you are making those mistakes, is there grace and gratitude around, like, what are the lessons that we're learning? Just those types of things as well. I just wanted to throw that in.
No. Well, so that was the perfect segue. And then I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. So I was going to say, the thing that you didn't mention that we know from the research and science, that once historically grounded people of color and Black-bodied people especially, was spiritual support. And I think we've missed that. And this isn't religion or religiosity. It really is having practices that are grounding and mindfulness and a community where you can belong. And again, this isn't me being evangelical, just the data around protective factor says, if something gives you hope, if something grounds you, I know when I'm talking to more mature folks, and now I'm definitely in that category, but when I talk to more wise individuals, they frequently ask me, why do I think people have more mental unwellness, right? More diagnostic, more signs of mental distress. The data shows it. Like, what's different? Because if you think about, like, particularly for Black-bodied folks, all the things that we've overcome, why would now there be so much mental distress? And I say, from my awareness, and this is Karen, there's no data to prove it, that the things that we used or had historically that kept us well, family, extended family, a sense of community, rest and play, an aesthetic, spiritual support, community, belonging, all of those things that we get, opportunity to serve, all of those things that we used to do culturally and historically, when you don't do them, the data says that you're vulnerable. And so when I'm talking to my wise leaders, I say, we now have to recreate structures, like, programs to do what we had in community that we knew promoted mental wellness and recovery. We just don't have them built. We've lost a lot of that. And I know there, or not lost, but it is more fragmented, because I think it's there. It's just not there structurally.
Yeah, it's not necessarily there. And I think also there is this, I can do it better than, because they may not have liked it when they were growing up. Just some of those things because of the trauma they may have experienced in those spaces.
Yeah.
And so I think, we oftentimes aren't honest about that,
Yeah.
which is that those places that were once seen as and viewed as healing spaces were not healed spaces for some people that, drove from there.
Yeah.
And we also had some people that came in and disrupted those spaces. So churches were bombed, buildings and communities were torched. So there is,
Yeah.
just to acknowledge that.
So let's have a more, I know I'm looking at the time, but
Okay.
would you agree that a more complex view of that is, as many of us, right, like, we think about acculturation, right? As many of us were acculturated, right, like left our communities and moved into more diverse environments, the things that we did historically to stay well were devalued, and we gave up stuff, right, to fit in, right, to belong into this majority. And I don't think, and yes, there were cultural and historical wounds, but that happens in, right, like we could, employers, neighborhood, right, like, and people don't leave those things. I think that no one thought about how essential healing strategies were, or resiliency building or wellness built, right? So when you devalue them and you're told like you don't need them, wouldn't you just sort of move into sort of doing stuff that you're like, well, I could get that need met through, and I'm not being like through a program, a service, a medication, a treatment, so we professionalized our healing and programmed our way into healing, rather than, because I think we just sort of thought that stuff we were doing was sort of, not worthy or low. So, because I don't know, talk to me, because you're the cultural competency person, but I just feel like culturally there was something that we lost.
Yeah, so culturally it was something that we lost, because again, we thought it was something that was going to be better than. And so when you think that something is better than, people said it all the time. The grass isn't always greener on the other side, just those types of things. Can we appreciate our grass where we are, appreciate the communities in which they are, appreciate the neighborhoods in which we live in, and also see again the assets that are there. Oftentimes we think it's going to be something better, but if we really were honest and looked at and really mapped all of the things or the strengths that we actually have in communities that are occupied by people of color, we might find out that there are a lot of strengths that are there. That just aren't even tapped into because of the barriers systematically that have been put in place.
I love it. So if someone is, as Maurice would say, in high hope neighborhoods, I love that reframing. If someone were like, where do I learn more? So I want to learn more about this whole mental resilience piece. And I loved that you keep reminding us to look for signs and symptoms of, mental health, because not just mental illness. So you're saying, hey, pay attention to all of these strengths and resources. There are all of these positive things happening. But if I wanted to learn more about some of the things that you were mentioning, where would I go? Do you have like a go-to list of your greatest hits or things that you would invite people to check out?
A go-to greatest hits list. So that's unfortunate that I've seen. I haven't found a collective space. What I've decided, just kind of like on my own mission, this is Chandra's mission. Chandra made a decision to embrace what is in her neighborhood and her community, instead of trying to seek it out from Chicago or Indianapolis, I've really tried to see what types of things are actually in my community and bring a buddy with me, bring someone to go along with me, or I go solo and try to really just enjoy the being in the space and oftentimes not focus on the structure. And I know that that's very hard to do. But and this is Chandra's journey again, when I go to visit Champaign County and see what tourists are doing in our community, I can go and actually say, wow, this was not a space that was welcoming for me. Can you point me to a space that might be welcoming to me? When you don't go, oftentimes people don't know that the space is not inviting to BIPOC people. Like it's people don't know because we don't go. So I have challenged myself to get out of my comfort zone, to go places. And of course, historically, like we're not gonna go visit sundown towns all the time just because there's a history there. But in our local community, there are so many things, so many parks, so many spaces that are available that we can go and just get a space of wellness. So park districts, walking trails, visit Champaign County, we all can go and eat and do different things, but also just the different festivals that are happening. Because in the summer, there's so many different festivals in our community that we can go and be a part of. And it's not like you're just doing something that white people or other people are doing. This is available to people in our community. So that's kind of like my go-to. I go on the websites. I have several of them that I look at, but I do look at Visit Champaign County, look at the Chamber, Chambana Moms, Buy Black Chambana, Facebook. If you just type in events, you can go and look for those spaces. And like I said, just get you about 2 or 3 people, or you can go alone. I'm sure you'll meet someone else that's alone that's there, and then you all can be together.
So again, you went someplace that I wasn't expecting, but I loved it. So I just want to make sure that, your suggestion was, if we want to think about Black mental health, wellness, and recovery, one of the things that you could do is to commit yourself to Black mental health, wellness, and recovery. And that is
yourself. Absolutely.
To be engaged, involved, to explore, to appreciate cultural diversity, to take advantage of all of the resources and protective factors that are in your backyard, to ally, connect, build social connections and supports. And I think it's interesting that we've had this whole broad and deep conversation about Black mental health and wellness and recovery. And we have not talked about like clinical interventions or phone a friend or, like therapists or anything like that, that we really have grounded this into the things that help promote being, becoming, and belonging. And I want to make sure that the audience hears that if you are somebody who finds yourself getting caught up in a narrative about looking at the signs and symptoms of unwellness, like those people do, or they always, or, you associate violence with Black bodied people, particularly Black men, or poor parenting with one conceptualization. If you're repeating those narratives and thinking, what I hear us saying today is, wonder what happened to them, what's part of the narrative, what resources don't exist. Be curious. Also, know that you're just seeing the surface, because I love the fact that, Chandra, you keep mentioning there are so many strands that if you look beneath the surface, right, we're all complex beings, and no matter what you present with, there's more to the story.
Absolutely.
And so I loved all of your sharing. do you have final words before we are all done? Because this has been a beautiful conversation.
I think if I could just say anything, Black wellness does just not belong to you. Your Black mental health just does not belong to your doctor or therapist. Black healing belongs to everyone, and it can be a part of a larger conversation. But most of all, we are all in community as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. What a great kickoff to this conversation. We will be exploring variations of this topic throughout the month. So hopefully we peppered you with like some curiosities. We look forward to you finding information in the chat. We will be putting links to like BIPOC Awareness Month. We didn't even talk about the origins of it, but we will be putting links to that if you want to learn more, and have a great Liberty weekend. Take care. And Chandra, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me today.